This is the second in the writing workshop series by the Professional Development Program of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Today we are going to look at how to move from thesis statements to writing actual pages of your project, either dissertation or article, although we will mostly look at dissertations. And this workshop assumes that you understand about thesis statements and how tight they need to be. And I'll just review very quickly that a thesis statement is a 1 to 2 sentence statement that describes your research argument and explains how you will achieve it. So in its description, it states the subject of your argument, the who, what, where, when, which actually serves to locate your argument and put some boundaries around what you're going to discuss, how you're going to make your argument, whether you're going to go through textual criticism, historical methodology, sociocritical reading, whatever your methodology is. And also a thesis statement says why you are writing something, the significance of what you're writing. The thesis statement will guide every single section that you write, and we will see how that works in this workshop. So to begin, we're going to just talk a little bit about an outline. There is a difference between an outline and a table of contents. An outline is a one-page document that you update and send with every single email you send to any single person on your committee. Every time you send them an email about your dissertation, attach your updated one-page outline so that they know where you're at. When you go to meet with someone on your committee, bring with you 2 copies of your one-page outline, one for you and one for the person you're talking to. The one-page outline lets everybody stay on the same page as far as your dissertation is concerned. And here's what it looks like. Across the top, you have your working title, and immediately under that, you have your thesis statement. Both of these should be bold, centered, 12-point font, right there at the top. The next thing you will have on your one-page outline are chapter headings with the estimated number of pages in each chapter. This helps you to keep on track as far as your research and writing goes, and helps you to make sure that you have given a balanced amount to every section in your dissertation, so you don't end up with a 60-page methodology chapter and a 20-page analysis chapter. Under each chapter heading is bullet-pointed info that you want to discuss. Major themes, major writings, major thinkers that you want to talk about. This can be in any order. In your outline, you don't have to have it in the order that you plan to write it, because this will move around and shift depending on how your writing is going. Then you have your next chapter heading, bullet points, so forth. I would also recommend that on every single page to do with your dissertation, every single document, you have a footer or a header with your name and today's date. So use your automatic date function on your word processor so that when you print something and you file it and then you go back and look at it, you know how recent this document is. And this up-to-date thing includes your dissertation file and your dissertation chapters and helps you keep track of when you wrote something that you have printed and are holding in your hand, and of course, page numbers. So here is an example of a one-page outline. This is a dissertation called Pulcheria in Chalcedon, and the thesis statement of this particular dissertation is the personal letters of Empress Pulcheria to her eunuch demonstrate that she was the driving force behind the Council of Chalcedon. This thesis statement could be tightened, could be added to, but for the purposes of our outline, it'll work. So we have chapter 1, History of Empress Pulcheria. Let's just say that's 30 pages. Some things we want to talk about. Her first husband died, her second husband died. We want to talk about Pulcheria and her eunuch. So that would be another chapter. Maybe that's another 30 pages. We want to frame the history of the empresses and her eunuchs in this chapter. We want to talk about the eunuchs and their relationship with the church in this chapter. And then we want a chapter in Pulcheria and the bishops, and that would be maybe 40 pages. And there we're going to talk about Pulcheria and Nestorius, and Pulcheria and Pope Leo. So those are the major points to hit in each chapter. So next, the outline becomes a table of contents. So we take out the working title and the thesis statement, And the table of contents is where you set up the auto page function, which means you go into your document and you start to assign sections and chapter headings to your document, and you'll have to look at your specific software to see how that works. But you can set up the table of contents so that it automatically updates the page numbers as you go in your table of contents. In the table of contents, the bulleted items that we had in the outline become your section headings, and you can move these around as you see fit, but they will be the major headings of what you're doing in each chapter. And at this point, I want to say that for some really good examples of section headings and tables of contents, and in fact where a lot of this material in this presentation comes from, is the book by Peg Boyle-Single, Demystifying Dissertation Writing, and it's by Stylus Publishing, and it's available on Amazon for $14, and I highly recommend that you order a copy or see if there's someone who has a copy that you can borrow, because it's a very helpful book for conceiving of the dissertation as a whole and with a coherent thesis statement that runs as a theme throughout the entire dissertation. So the table of contents, which is fairly basic, we're not going to look at an example of it, but it becomes your long outline. And in the long outline, every chapter needs its own thesis statement. So you will have a thesis statement for your dissertation as a whole, and then you will have a very strong thesis statement for each chapter. And the important thing to note here is use full sentences for each chapter's thesis statement. So don't use shorthand for yourself, that in chapter 1 you're going to say methodology is literary criticism. That's not a sentence, and that's not a thesis statement. Your thesis statement might be literary criticism offers the best method for unpacking the documents of Chalcedon. And the reason that this should be a full sentence is, first of all, it tells you what you're trying to do when you go back 3 months later and you can't remember in your chapter. But also this may become the very first sentence of your chapter. And every sentence you can write ahead of time is always helpful. The second thing I want to say, and I'm sorry that runs out of the bottom there, but double check whether each chapter thesis statement reflects your dissertation thesis statement. If you have a chapter thesis statement that has nothing to do with your dissertation thesis statement, you may not need that chapter. In fact, you probably don't need that chapter, and you should rethink what you are addressing in that chapter. So, in each chapter, I mentioned that every bulleted item point becomes a section. And I would suggest no more than 3 or 4 sections for each chapter. If you do more than that, you might actually have to break down your chapter into 2. So each section begins with a thesis statement, which again, these are full sentences, and you double check with your chapter thesis statement. So here we have a multiplicity of thesis statements that go from the section level, that check upwards, that they fit with the chapter level, which check upwards to make sure that they fit with your dissertation thesis statement. And don't forget that sections can move around, so as you're writing this chapter, if you don't like where you've placed the section, you can always just move it around. That's not a problem. So here we have an example now of what your long outline looks like with your thesis statements and your sections. And this is from the book by Peg Boyle-Single, and it's on page 117 if you happen to have the book with you. So you'll notice you have the chapter heading, your chapter thesis statement, and then you have your section headings and your section thesis statement. So the section should agree with the chapter, and the chapter should agree with the overall dissertation. Now let's look at a very particular example. We had talked about Pulcheria and Chalcedon, and we have our thesis statement of Pulcheria and Chalcedon. Then we have our first chapter, the history of the empress, and we have our first thesis statement for this chapter. Pulcheria came from a family heavily involved in the church. Does this fit with the dissertation thesis statement? In the dissertation, we're saying that the empress was the driving force behind the Council of Chalcedon, so yes, these two fit. Next, we have our section heading. So we want to talk about Pulcheria's father. we have a thesis statement for our section. Pulcheria's father appointed bishops for the church. Does this fit with our chapter statement? Pulcheria came from a family heavily involved in the church. Yes. So we have now some coherence and a theme that is driving this chapter. The next section is Pulcheria's husbands. So Pulcheria's first husband favored Nestorius but died under mysterious circumstances, while her second husband favored Pope Leo. This is true, actually. So we have our section heading. So 1b section heading has a thesis statement. This will drive the writing that's in this section. All right, next we have our chapter 2 thesis statement. Pulcheria wrote many personal letters with her eunuch beyond what other empresses historically wrote. Does this fit with our dissertation thesis statement? The personal letters of Empress Pulcheria to her eunuch demonstrates that. So yes, we're talking about personal letters with the eunuch. So we need to talk about, as a subheading, what do empresses and eunuchs, what's their typical writing habit? So, empresses did not ask their eunuchs to bribe bishops. Does this fit with our chapter thesis statement? It does, because in our chapter thesis statement we said beyond what other empresses historically wrote. All right, we are moving on to the second section in chapter 2, Pulcheria and her eunuch. Letters document Pulcheria asking her eunuch to bribe the bishops. So this is our thesis statement of section 2b. So hopefully you can understand how the thesis statement of each section drives towards the thesis statement for the chapter, which drives towards the thesis statement for the dissertation. And then Pulcheria and the bishops. Oh, that ran off the bottom again. Pulcheria and Nestorius were hostile to one another, but Pulcheria and Pope Leo, and that should say, shared the same doctrinal beliefs. All right, let's move on. So after you have your section heading and your section thesis statement, you're going to continue with your subheadings and your thesis statements. And all of this long outline, this broad thing that I have so far, this is something that you can develop as soon as you start your research, because this is the stuff that's going to change as you go along, but this is also allows you to sort of jump around in your research, which some people like to do. They sometimes like to write later chapters before they write earlier chapters. And this will work because you'll already have in your head the entire map of what you're doing. So you can put subheadings in. I would not advise that you go deeper than subheadings and thesis statements at this level until you actually have a draft of your dissertation. If you need to go deeper than the subsection level, the subheading level, you may actually need to convert your subsection to a section. You might need to bump it up to give it more weight. And don't forget that subsections can be reordered. You can move all that stuff around in there, and that's what is the advantage of having everything in this long outline form. It allows you to move the sections around, and when you have it tied automatically to your table of contents, you don't have to go back and revise the table of contents. Also, just a note, revise the page estimates as you go and pay attention to the table of contents, how many pages it's showing you have, because it will keep track for you of when you need to stop researching. If you realize as you're researching that you have written 80 pages for one chapter and 20 pages for another chapter, that's a signal to you that you have to stop researching for the 80-page chapter and start researching for the 20-page chapter. So here is an example of a long outline, or that's not an example, but here's what the long outline with the subsections should look like. It's got chapter heading, chapter thesis statement, section heading, section thesis statement, subsection heading with thesis statement. And you can see how far you go down with thesis statements. And this is really important. A thesis statement for every subsection really makes sure that you don't get lost in the details of what you're writing and that your dissertation doesn't take a side detour and never come back from it. So here's our example of Pulcheria. So we have our history, our chapter thesis statement, our section thesis statement, subsection. Pulcheria's father and the Bishop of Alexandria. And our thesis statement for the subsection. Pulcheria's father gave the Bishop of Alexandria forces to stop the riots. So, Does this tie in with our section thesis statement? Pulcherius' father appointed bishops for the church. Yes. Does this tie in with our chapter thesis statement? Pulcheria came from a family heavily involved in the church. Yes. Therefore, we can assume it will tie in with our dissertation thesis heading. And it gives some context for Pulcheria's drive to shape this important church council. Okay, so then we have our section, Pulcheria's husband, and we have our thesis statement for our first section, and we have our thesis, our subsection. Now, Pulcheria's husband Theodosius and Nestorius, thesis statement for that, Emperor Theodosius favored Nestorius. Next, we have another subsection, Pulcheria's husband Marius and Nestorius. And we have our thesis statement for this subsection. Emperor Marius was a soldier. Now, this may be very important. This may be a critical little quirk of emperor relationships in the history of emperors at this time. In fact, he was a soldier, which made it very unusual for her to marry him. But, as important and as interesting as this is, does this thesis statement fit with everything else? Emperor Marius was a soldier. Does this have anything to do with our section thesis statement? Pulcheria's first husband favored Nestorius, but died under mysterious circumstances, while her second husband favored Pope Leo. So the answer would be, no, not really. There's no direct connection. So even though you might have done 30 pages of research on Emperor Marius's progression from being a soldier to an emperor, you're going to have to leave it aside. And a lot of dissertation writing is saying no to research that we've already done, but it doesn't fit. And if you put it in, people are going to get confused as to why you are bringing up this very interesting but irrelevant piece of research. So you would have to change the thesis statement on your subsection to say something about Emperor Marius did not like Nestorius. So that's our long outline. The really great thing about the long outline is that it becomes writing without too much work. So what you do is you look at your sections, and as you're reading and researching and writing and making notes, you put quotes into the appropriate sections and into the appropriate subsections. The best way to do that is to rewrite them and to properly cite them. You don't want to have too many direct quotes in a dissertation, but you include those in your long outline. And as you will see, your long outline will sort of word by word grow to be a dissertation. They show you where you need to do more research and where you need to stop reading. I already mentioned that. If you notice that you have 15 quotes in one section, or 15 citations and 2 in another section, you may need to stop researching the 15 citation section and move on to the 2 citation section. So here we have an example, Pulcheria. Alright, so in our section on Pulcheria's father and our subsection on her father and the Bishop of Alexandria, we have our thesis statement. Pulcheria's father gave the Bishop of Alexandria forces to stop the riots. And our quote. So you're researching, and all of a sudden you find a letter where the Bishop of Alexandria writes to Pulcheria's father and says, I need to stop the riots. And you have another letter of Pulcheria's father responding to the Bishop of Alexandria saying, I am sending you 70 soldiers. So you put that in there. And then you have a third quote. Historians say that there is documented evidence of troops moving from the emperor to the Bishop of Alexandria. Something like that. So as you see, as you rewrite these, you're already starting to write your dissertation while you're doing your outline. Alright, and then we have the rest of that. So I want to finish by talking about productive writing habits as you are working on shifting from the outline to the long outline to the actual writing. The first thing that's really important is to write regularly. Discipline produces more than inspiration does. And it may be the case that in seminar papers you were able to wait for some inspiration and sit down and then write something 2 weeks before it was due, or file for an incomplete and get an extra couple weeks to write your paper. But this is not the case with dissertations, and this is not the case with professional academic writing. You need to have a regular habit of the way that you write, and you will find that you end up with producing more and of better quality than if you just wait for inspiration to hit you. Another tip is don't reread everything you wrote the day before. This is where sometimes people get tripped up. They sit down at their computer to write and they say, well, I'm just going to reread the last chapter. And the next thing you know, 2 hours have passed and you've ended up revising your chapter wonderfully, but you haven't written anything new. So it can be really detrimental to getting pages done to reread what you wrote the day before. The best thing is maybe just read the sentence, or before you stop writing for the day, write the first sentence of the next section you're going to work on. And then that's where you start. Don't wait for inspiration. I said that already. Inspiration comes from discipline. And one of the things that's really important is write to revise. In other words, count on making revisions. Revisions are the most important way of improving your writing. And don't wait for the sentence to be perfect in your head before you sit down and write it. Write down the ugly sentence and then revise it later. If you don't revise, your writing actually won't improve. And the whole point of what we're doing in the dissertation program is improving your skills in written communication of what you're researching. So write to revise. Write with the intention that at some point down the road you will make it perfect. But for right now, you're just getting it on the page. And finally, I want to advise you to begin a work-back timeline. So in other words, start with your dissertation deadline on the calendar and work backwards from there to figure out how much time you need to allot to research and writing for each chapter. And I do want to remind you that at the GTU, your dissertation committee needs your dissertation 4 weeks before your defense. So if you work back from the filing deadline of the semester you plan to file in, and you say you're going to give yourself 2 weeks for revision, and you pick that's your defense date, you actually need to be finished your dissertation an entire month before your defense date. So keep that in mind when you're planning your work back timeline. And I would recommend the online dissertation calculator, which will help you do this timeline. It's at this website, and you go in and you plug in your hopeful defense date, and it will calculate some of the big things for you. Things like when you should be finding your committee, when you should be writing your proposal, when you should be working on your methodology chapter, when you should be working on your bibliography, things like that. So hopefully this workshop was helpful for you. And if you are at the GTU in the spring 2014 semester, there will be a follow-up workshop to this on campus. And if you're not, I do recommend, again, that you purchase Peg Boyle-Single's book that I mentioned called Demystifying Dissertation Writing. And it's available on Amazon. And if you want to support your local bookstore, you can ask them to order it for you.